Over the last few weeks, we've seen the India-US relationship really enter what can only be called free fall. We've seen the Trump administration take on India for its purchases of Russian energy. A trade deal between the two countries at this point in time seems to be deadlocked. We're also seeing increasing tensions between India and the United States in the political dimension, something that has not been seen really for decades in the India-US relationship. At this point in time, you're seeing Prime Minister Narendra Modi heading off to China for a meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. You're also seeing President Vladimir Putin set to make a visit to India over the next year. And there are questions about whether these bruising battles with the United States are leading to a broader reorientation in India's foreign policy. But joining me right now on HT Podcast to unpack how Washington is looking at what is happening is someone who has served in the Trump administration at the highest levels, Ambassador John Bolton. He has been National Security Advisor to President Trump during his first term and has also been the United States Ambassador to the United Nations. Ambassador Bolton, thank you so much for joining us. Could I simply begin by asking you to explain something very basic to Indians who don't really understand where this has come from? Just a couple of months ago, India was a close strategic ally of the United States. And now things seem to have changed entirely, a 180-degree turn, as it were. You have been President Trump's national security advisor. Could you channel some of his thinking and explain to us what exactly is Washington's thinking right now in India?
Well, I think it's unfortunately very confused, and it stems from a number of factors. I think the first level of concern is the tariffs that emerged out of the so-called Liberation Day tariffs in April, where Indian negotiators were working to try and get a mutually satisfactory arrangement, and Trump kind of pulled the plug without warning and said the tariffs would be at 25%. The only consolation I can give there is that it happened to a lot of other countries too. This is part of how chaotic this whole tariff issue is. I think it's very harmful to the United States, harmful to the global economy, harmful to our political relations with many countries, and India being unfortunately near the top of that list. The second is the 25% addition to that tariff because of purchases of Russian oil and gas. I think comes again from a different form of confusion in the Trump White House. He's obviously focused on trying to reach a ceasefire or ultimately a settlement between Ukraine and Russia. And he had threatened Russia with sanctions and threatened secondary sanctions on countries buying oil and gas. It turns out, of course, that at least as of today, and that's a big if, as of today, Russia has not faced any new sanctions. China has not faced any new sanctions, notwithstanding the fact that they were the major purchasers of Russian oil and gas. Only India has been singled out. And, my own personal view is I wish India didn't buy oil and gas from Russia. I think there ought to be ways to find it at a good price elsewhere, because I think that it's in the interest of India, as well as the United States and other countries, to recognize the threat posed by China, the growing axis between China and Russia, and the threat that means in East Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, a kind of global threat. And so leaving India hanging out to dry as the only country to which punitive action has been taken because of the Russian-Ukraine conflict at this point obviously leads a lot of people to conclude that somehow the United States has given up on India or something like that. And I do worry that India is being driven closer to Russia and China. All I can say is I think it's just part of the aberrational Trump presidency. It doesn't reflect any change in the real strategic environment, or I think where India's ultimate strategic interests lie. But it's a very bad place for the relationship at the moment. I think that's correct.
Right. Could you tell us a little bit about, this question now of how India deals with something like this? Because there's a sense of confusion that, yes, India is the one that's been hit with tariffs, but China hasn't, and neither has Turkey. So the question from the Indian side is that it also seems to be driven by some personality-based factors that we're hearing about India not necessarily giving credit to the Trump administration for the ceasefire that took place between India and Pakistan, for helping broker that. So there's a sense that there's a great deal of unpredictability that is derailing the relationship that we don't necessarily know how to deal with. You've been at the highest levels of the White House working with President Trump. How would you advise a country like India to look at something like what's happened over the last couple of weeks and try to salvage this? How does that work?
Well, it's difficult because there are a number of factors. You mentioned the developments after the most recent terrorist attack in Kashmir, where Trump basically took credit for de-escalating the conflict. Uh, I mean, I know from my own experience in the last major terrorist attack in Kashmir in 2019 that was resolved by India and Kashmir satisfactorily to both of them, and I think that's what happened in this most recent repetition. I think Trump probably called to offer help. I can just tell you back in 2019, Mike Pompeo and I spoke with Ajit Doval. We spoke with our Pakistani counterparts, and that's basically all we said. And it was resolved without American help. So a lot of countries, I'm sure, called recently, and I think it shows good faith on all their part. But Trump took credit for it because he's running for the Nobel Peace Prize, and that's India. Pakistan's now one of the six wars that he's solved in the last 6 months, and he's hoping Ukraine will be the seventh, and that will be the capstone to his application form. Um, it is more of the erratic nature of decision making in the Trump White House than it is any grand strategy with respect to India. It's not because we're playing three-dimensional chess. It's we're not being careful one move versus another, dealing with one conflict that has spillover to yet another. So there's no ready answer to it other than grit your teeth and try and keep an even keel, even though these adverse developments keep coming. It's also the case that the chief of the army staff in Pakistan, General Munir, offered to nominate Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize, which is what he wants. And the only thing I could say there is, maybe Prime Minister Modi can say he'll nominate Trump twice for a Nobel Peace Prize. That's what's going on here.
Could you tell us a little bit about this question now of trust? Fareed Zakaria, in a column that I think has gone viral now in India, has basically said that India has now seen something very ugly coming from the United States, or at least this administration, which is Washington's willingness to be brutal with countries that it calls its allies, while Secretary Scott Bessent was on television yesterday defending Chinese oil purchases from Russia, while, of course, coming down hard on India for purchasing Russian energy. And there's this question now about trust in the relationship and how badly that has been damaged, and whether anything can really repair that trust and that arc of improving India-US relations. So could you speak a little bit to that, to an Indian audience, about why India should go back to Washington and say this is a partnership that we can trust fundamentally, because America did elect Trump. He's been elected twice now. So this is
Yeah.
not that Trump is not America.
Well, he had two very weak opponents. He actually had three very weak opponents. He just didn't make it in 2020 because of COVID more than anything else. Secretary Bessent isn't very experienced in international affairs, and I don't think he sees the growing axis between China and Russia, and the fact that China is very much the dominant partner in that relationship, and that has enormous implications down the road. The complaint, as I've heard it, is that India took some of the gasoline it was buying, some of the oil it was buying from Russia, perhaps refined it, and then sold it in international markets. And I can see where I think that's a complaint worth discussing. It's one thing to say we're buying because we're going to buy the lowest cost energy we can for the good of the Indian people. But I have to say also that the sanctions as written do not preclude India or anybody else from buying at the capped Russian oil price or below $60 a barrel and then selling it elsewhere. So if that's what the complaint is, the complaint lies with the sanctions, not so much with India's behavior. Part of the reason the price cap is there at all is that the US and Europe didn't want to impose a complete prohibition on the purchase of Russian oil because they wanted to keep global energy prices down. They didn't want to force Russian oil off the market entirely because they didn't want price at the gas pump in the United States or Europe to go up. And what that shows is when you've got sanctions that have two different goals, in fact, two contradictory goals, one is reduce revenues to Russia for the sake of the war, the other is to keep U.S. gasoline prices at home down, those are contradictory. the right answer is the right answer from the sanctions drafter is to say it's prohibited to buy any Russian oil or gas. Now that poses other difficulties, but if you don't like what India has done, then amend the sanctions to say no purchases of Russian gas permissible under these sanctions can be sold onward at a higher price to other countries. Then if India had violated that part of the sanctions, there'd be a difference. But the sanctions don't prohibit what India did.
Right. Ambassador Bolton, if I could bring you back to that question of trust moving forward in the partnership with America. Lots of commentators over the years in India have been skeptical about the relationship with the United States. They're saying that, look, this is a country that fundamentally has a lot more leverage than we do. That's the question, do you have the cards? And the sense that there is in India is that, yes, America is willing now to use its leverage in a way that is coercive, is extremely transactional, and is in some ways brutal. And you've seen President Trump speak in a very appreciatory tone about tariffs, saying that we're willing to use it time and again for our foreign policy instruments. There's a sense that defense technology could be something that America uses as well. And for example, our fighter jet, something like General Electric fighter jet engines, which India is co-developing with the United States to use for our fighter jets, is something that India took a significant leap of trust in the United States to develop that partnership after years and years, as you might be familiar with, of suspicion about Washington. What do you think what has happened over the last couple of weeks does to trust in the relationship? And if you're speaking to an Indian audience as you are now, how do you pitch to them that the American relationship is one that they should still rely on, should still work on, should still continue to develop?
Well, unfortunately, what Trump has done on the tariffs generally is destroy decades of effort with India, but with a lot of other countries as well, to build up good faith and trust and reliance on the United States. And it will take time to repair that. That's the unfortunate reality. But here's where I think it's important to understand that Trump is aberrational. I don't know anybody else, Republican or Democrat, who ran for president, let's just say in 2024, who, if elected, would behave anything like this. Trump's doing a lot of things domestically in the United States that are cause for great concern for us as well. And I don't know any other candidate from 2024 who would do that. Trump doesn't have a philosophy. So I think ultimately there's no legacy for him to leave to his successors, whoever they might be. And I believe that the force of his personality inhibits a lot of people from speaking up, but that doesn't mean they agree with what he's doing. That's very unfortunate in my view. But I think the true strategic sense here, particularly for a country like India with its assets and capabilities and threats that it faces right on its own border, is just to take a deep breath and remember that the world's going to last longer than the next 3.5 years, and it's not pleasant to go through this. I'm not going to try and persuade anybody of that. But our objective should be to keep the damage to the relationship at a minimum, and then to think about how to repair it as quickly as we can thereafter. Because I think that when Trump walks off the stage, he will take almost the bulk of this history with him.
Mm-hmm. Right. And Ambassador Bolton, could I ask you maybe one or two final questions, which is one on what we've seen largely with the MAGA movement in the United States. There is a concern now growing in India that some of what we've seen has been fairly ugly. In terms of some Indians have seen rising questions of racism from some individuals like Laura Loomer, who seem to be close to the president as advisors. They have really taken on India on this question of immigration, which is a question that India has been happy to discuss with the president of the United States. But there's a sense that the tone in the MAGA movement when it comes to India has shifted and shifted in a very negative way. So the sense is that even if President Trump goes off the stage, the next Republican president dealing with these issues is going to have to deal with a MAGA base that is actually perfectly happy going after India on questions like immigration. Also, politically, finding that India is a soft target because it's not China, it's not Russia. It can't fundamentally push back as much as these two countries can. Your view?
Well, I think there's a part of the Trump base that is susceptible to that criticism. It's legitimate to say that. Some of them are just crazy, but the base in the Republican Party for Trump has a lot more to do with what he's doing on domestic issues, and I don't think that necessarily transfers to everything else that he does. I think there's a very substantial part in the Republican Party who understand that immigration is incredibly important to the United States. That having foreign students in our universities is a plus for the United States. It's a plus for the students, but it's a plus for the United States as well. And that being concerned about illegal immigrants coming across the border is one thing. Every country should be allowed to determine who gets in and who doesn't, but that it's in America's interest, at least in my view, that we should increase legal immigration. And that happens in some substantial part as economic ties between countries grow as well. So it's really unfortunate from the perspective of the U.S. that some of the statements by the more extreme Trump supporters have this effect, and I think some of the things even people in the administration do gives the impression that we just want to put a big wall up and keep everybody else out. It'd be a huge mistake for the U.S. and it doesn't reflect where the country is. It certainly doesn't reflect where the Republican Party is as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Right. And Master Bolton, could I ask you about what we're seeing on the China question? We've seen that President Trump and his team have been quite insistent on getting to a deal with the Chinese. What would you say about what the Trump administration's policy is on China? Because it has seemed confused at times. India, for example, has been working with the United States very closely on these questions of China's increasing military and economic dominance in the Indo-Pacific. And there's a sense that we don't really know what the Trump administration wants. You see, of course, a hard push for a deal. President Trump talking about this great relationship that he has with Xi Jinping of China. At the same time, of course, you're seeing expanded sanctions against China, more human rights enforcement on Chinese entities linked to, let's say, Uyghur labor camps in Xinjiang. What exactly is the Trump administration's policy on China? What are we to make of what they're thinking?
It's confused. Going back to the first term, Trump wanted a trade deal with China then. He wanted what he called the biggest trade deal in history. When he went to China in 2017, he at a lunch that Prime Minister Theresa May gave Trump at Chequers in the spring of 2018, after the NATO summit, before the famous summit with Putin and Trump in Helsinki. And she had him out to lunch at Chequers. The rest of us were there. And Trump said to her, as the conversation went on, he said, when I went to China in 2017, they gave me the biggest reception they had ever given to any visitor in history. And so we all sat there and said silently, how can he possibly know that? What does that even mean? But to him, to have this biggest trade deal in history has been a focus for a long time. And he's ignored a lot of things. China's deadlines have now been extended 180 days. As we mentioned before, they didn't get hit with the secondary sanctions on purchase of Russian oil and gas. There have been restrictions. There have been some limitations on licensing of chip technology, but some others have been allowed. I think because they think they're facilitating this big deal. I think it's very damaging and very dangerous to proceed this way. I think that if you want to have a trade war with somebody, we all should have gotten together and had a trade war with China, because they're the worst actor in international economics. They're the ones who steal intellectual property, subsidize their companies, don't open up their internal market even when they say they're going to. And it is very difficult to explain to anybody else why he gives China this much leeway. In fact, in a very politically divided America at the moment, the one thing that really generates bipartisan political support in Congress is tough measures toward China. So this is one where, as we call it, it would be an 80-20 issue for Trump if he took a hard line on China. All I can say is there are plenty of people in the Republican Party and elsewhere who understand exactly this point, and we'll see if they can get through to Trump.
Right. Then, Master, my last question, I guess, to you is this question of where we go from here, which is that there is a sense, yes, in India, that if you look at what Ukraine and President Zelensky have gone through over the last 6 months, which is that they had that beat-down confrontation in the White House 6 months ago. Now President Zelensky is back. And of course, America is selling defense equipment to the European nations to pass on to Ukraine, intelligence supports, talk of security guarantees. There is a sense that the conversation has turned around. And so there is a sense that given a certain period of time, India and the United States could return to some level of normalcy. But there's also a problem for India, which is that the mood has become very politically militant. In India, the US relationship has become controversial in a way that it has not been for decades. And that minimizes the space someone like Prime Minister Modi has to make that sort of outreach to the United States and to receive an outreach from President Trump. So, your sense from someone who's worked with the Indian leadership, who knows President Trump, is what is a realistic plan over the next 6 months to a year to get this relationship back on track?
Well, I think a couple things. Number one, I think we need to have continued conversations among non-governmental Indians and Americans, so that people can understand that what's happening at the very top level is not reflective of what the rest of the country thinks. And it's not much consolation, but Trump does this all the time, and that's one reason I don't think he's fit to be president. But it's happened, and I think the potential now is what Prime Minister Modi should look to do is wait for the right moment to take Trump aside very privately and say, we've got to fix this. One suggestion would be if Modi is coming to the opening of the UN General Assembly in New York in the third week in September, that's a time when foreign leaders have a lot of meetings on the side. The side meetings are more important than the opening of the General Assembly, but it's not one country coming to another's capital. Have a one-on-one between Trump and Modi, and let people say what they think of what's happened in the past several months, clear the air a little bit, and I think that would be helpful. I do think that at least before the tariff problem arose, that Trump and Modi did have a good personal relationship, and that is central to Trump's view of state-to-state relations. In fact, it's an oversimplification, but Modi has an advantage that Zelensky didn't have after the February episode in the Oval Office. He did have a good relationship, and I think still does. So that asset remains. And if it can be deployed effectively, as I say, maybe in September, that could be a step on the road to recovery.
Ambassador John Bolton, Trump's former national security advisor and one of America's senior most diplomats, thank you so much for your time, for explaining to us here on Hindustan Times about how India and the United States can look at what's happening in the relationship and also what the two sides can do moving forward to reduce these tensions that we've seen over the last month or so. Thank you so much, Ambassador Bolton.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Thanks so much.